What happens when a peaceful nation loses its voice? When fear replaces freedom, and silence becomes the loudest sound in the streets? The story of Uruguay's military attack war isn't just about soldiers and battles. It's about a country that was forced into darkness and the quiet, unwavering courage that helped bring back the light. In 1973, Uruguay entered a period of military dictatorship that would last until 1985. This shift came after years of political instability, economic decline, and growing tensions between the government and leftist guerrilla groups like the Tupac. Amid rising violence and fear, President Juan Maria Bordaberry dissolved the General Assembly with the support of the armed forces, effectively handing power to the military. This marked the beginning of a repressive regime that suspended civil liberties, silenced opposition voices, and dismantled democratic institutions. The military established a tight grip on society through censorship, surveillance, and the banning of political parties. Thousands of Uruguayans were arrested without trial, and many were subjected to torture and inhumane treatment. Prisons were filled with political detainees, including intellectuals, students, union leaders, and anyone suspected of dissent. The regime relied heavily on secret police and intelligence agencies to monitor the population, creating a culture of fear and mistrust. Education, media, and the arts were strictly controlled, as the military sought to eliminate ideologies that conflicted with their authority. Families were torn apart, and many people disappeared without explanation. A phenomenon shared by several South American countries under similar regimes. Uruguay, once considered the Switzerland of South America for its stability and democratic traditions, became a place of deep repression and suffering. International human rights organizations began to document abuses, and growing internal resistance, especially from labor unions, religious groups, and students, helped pressure the regime over time. Despite the danger, many Uruguayans continued to organize quietly, refusing to let the spirit of democracy die. By the early 1980s, widespread protests and economic challenges weakened the military's hold on power, leading to negotiations for a peaceful transition back to civilian rule and democratic elections in 1984. The Tupac, officially known as the Movimiento de Liberación Nacional, emerged in Uruguay in the early 1960s as a leftist urban guerrilla group. Their roots lay in a growing frustration with social inequality, corruption, and the stagnating political system of the time. Influenced by the Cuban Revolution and other Marxist movements in Latin America, the Tupamaros initially focused on political activism and symbolic acts of resistance rather than direct violence. They became known for their Robin Hood-style operations, such as robbing banks and distributing food to the poor. As the economic crisis deepened in the late 1960s, the group escalated its activities. They carried out kidnappings, bombings, and assassinations aimed at undermining the state and gaining attention for their cause. They targeted foreign diplomats, wealthy businessmen, and members of the Uruguayan elite. In response, the government imposed a state of emergency and gave increasing power to the military to fight what it labeled as domestic terrorism. The conflict between the Tupamaros and the state intensified throughout the early 1970s. Security forces cracked down harshly, leading to the arrest, torture, and imprisonment of many members, including leaders such as Raul Sendic and José Mujica, who would later become president of Uruguay. By 1972, the group was largely dismantled through a brutal counterinsurgency campaign that involved widespread human rights abuses. However, the fear generated by the guerrilla movement served as one of the key justifications for the military's eventual seizure of power in 1973. While their immediate impact diminished, the Tupamaros left a lasting mark on Uruguay's political and social landscape. Many former members re-entered public life after the return to democracy, choosing political participation over armed struggle, and helped shape the nation's future through peaceful means. During Uruguay's military dictatorship from 1973 to 1985, state-sponsored repression became a systematic method used to control the population and eliminate political opposition. The regime justified its actions by claiming it was protecting the nation from subversion and internal enemies, particularly in the aftermath of the Tupamaros guerrilla movement. What followed was a tightly controlled society governed by fear, surveillance, and the denial of basic human rights. Thousands of people were arrested arbitrarily, often without formal charges or trials. Many of them were trade unionists, students, intellectuals, and suspected leftists. Political prisoners were subjected to brutal treatment, including beatings, electrocution, mock executions, and psychological torture. Military prisons and detention centers became infamous for their inhumane conditions, with some detainees held in solitary confinement for years. Families were rarely informed of their loved ones' whereabouts, and enforced disappearances added to the climate of terror. The state also implemented widespread censorship, targeting newspapers, radio, books, and theater. Any form of artistic or intellectual expression that challenged the regime's ideology was banned. Schools were monitored to ensure that students were taught only the values sanctioned by the military. Informants operated throughout neighborhoods and workplaces, creating a culture of suspicion in which anyone could be reported for dissent. In coordination with Operation Condor, a transnational network of South American dictatorships, Uruguayan authorities collaborated with other regimes, like those in Argentina and Chile, to track down and eliminate political refugees across borders. Many Uruguayans living abroad were abducted, brought back, and imprisoned or killed. The military maintained strict control over the judiciary, suppressing legal appeals and denying justice to victims. By the time the dictatorship ended, it was estimated that more than 6,000 Uruguayans had been imprisoned for political reasons. The psychological and emotional scars of this era remained long after democracy was restored. Operation Condor was a covert intelligence sharing and military operation carried out in the 1970s and 1980s by several South American dictatorships, including Uruguay, Argentina, Chile, Brazil, Paraguay, and Bolivia. Its main objective was to eliminate political dissidents, especially leftists, Marxists, and suspected subversives, who posed a threat to the authoritarian regimes of the region. Uruguay played an active role in this network, working closely with neighboring countries to track, capture, and often execute individuals considered dangerous to state security. As internal repression intensified in Uruguay, many opposition figures fled abroad, seeking refuge in countries like Argentina and Chile. Through Operation Condor, the Uruguayan military collaborated with foreign security forces to locate these exiles. Cross-border abductions became common, where individuals were kidnapped in one country and secretly transported to another for interrogation, torture, or disappearance. This transnational system of repression blurred national boundaries and made escape nearly impossible for targeted individuals. Uruguayan intelligence agencies, particularly the Defense Information Service (SID), were instrumental in coordinating with counterparts in other nations. Victims of Condor operations included not only guerrilla fighters, but also journalists, students, union leaders, and even family members of suspected dissidents. Shared blacklists and secret detention centers allowed these regimes to operate as one repressive unit, often with tacit approval or support from global powers during the Cold War. The use of psychological warfare, disinformation, and brutal tactics under Condor reflected a deliberate strategy to instill fear and eliminate opposition. Families were left with no knowledge of the fate of their loved ones, and the secrecy surrounding the program ensured that many crimes remained hidden for decades. In Uruguay, the collaboration in Operation Condor became a dark chapter in its military history, and efforts to uncover the truth continue to this day through human rights investigations and judicial trials. Throughout Uruguay's military dictatorship, civilian resistance never entirely faded, even under extreme repression. Despite the risk of imprisonment, or worse, brave individuals and groups organized in secret or under the cover of legal activities to push back against authoritarian control. Workers' unions, student organizations, teachers, and religious leaders, played key roles in preserving the spirit of democracy and human dignity. Underground publications circulated information the government tried to suppress, and cultural spaces became quiet centers of dissent where artists and writers encoded resistance in their work. One of the most powerful acts of opposition came from the labor sector. The Uruguayan labor movement, historically strong and organized, held strikes and work stoppages to protest the dictatorship. These actions were often met with harsh retaliation, but they also helped keep resistance alive and inspired solidarity. Women, particularly mothers and grandmothers of the disappeared, began to demand answers from the state, forming human rights groups that later became central to Uruguay's transition. By the early 1980s, the military regime faced economic decline, international condemnation for its human rights abuses, and growing unrest from within the population. Civil society became more active as censorship loosened slightly and mass mobilizations gained momentum. A defining moment came in 1980 when the dictatorship proposed a new constitution to consolidate its power. In a national referendum, the people overwhelmingly rejected it, marking a turning point in the public's open rejection of military rule. Political parties, though previously banned or weakened, began to reorganize and participate in calls for democratic restoration. Negotiations between military leaders and civilian representatives eventually led to the 1984 elections. In 1985, democracy was officially restored, and the last political prisoners were freed. The recovery was slow and marked by the challenge of dealing with the legacy of fear, but Uruguay's democratic institutions began to rebuild on the foundation laid by years of civilian courage. The legacy of Uruguay's military era continues to shape its society, politics, and national consciousness decades after the return to democracy in 1985. One of the most lasting effects is the deep psychological trauma carried by survivors, families of the disappeared, and a population that lived under constant surveillance and fear. The dictatorship's use of torture, censorship, and disappearances left scars that could not be healed simply by the restoration of civilian rule. Many people who experienced repression firsthand struggled for years with silence, stigma, and the challenge of rebuilding lives interrupted by detention, exile, or loss in the political sphere. Debates over how to handle past crimes became central to Uruguay's democratic transition. A controversial amnesty law passed in 1986 granted immunity to many military officials accused of human rights abuses, sparking national and international criticism. Human rights groups, survivors, and concerned citizens campaigned for decades to repeal this law and bring perpetrators to justice. These efforts intensified in the 2000s as trials reopened and several former military officers were eventually convicted. Yet tensions remain between calls for accountability and those advocating for forgiveness or forgetting in the name of national unity. The military era also had a lasting impact on Uruguay's institutions. The importance of democratic norms, civilian control over the armed forces, and the protection of human rights became central to public discourse and education. School curricula began to include the history of the dictatorship, and memorials were built to honor the victims. Former political prisoners and resistance leaders took part in public life, including figures like José Mujica, a former Tupamaro who later served as president. The memory of repression remains a point of reflection, cautioning future generations about the fragility of democracy and the need for vigilance, empathy, and justice in safeguarding freedom. The history of Uruguay's military attack war is a story woven with pain, courage, and the enduring strength of its people. From the rise of authoritarian rule and the silencing of voices to the quiet defiance of civilians who never stopped believing in justice, Uruguay walked a long, difficult path. The scars of repression still linger, but so do the lessons of resilience. Through memory, truth, and a commitment to democracy, Uruguay continues to heal. This story reminds us that even in the darkest moments, the will of the people can light the way forward.